Alright, this is going to be a tutorial on my workflow rigging this character with Advanced Skeleton. And I'll break this up into a few parts. And this is just going to be the setup and prepping your model section. And this is actually really important. It's really important to have that good foundation. Each step along the way with Advanced Skeleton builds on the last. And if you don't set up your model properly, you're going to have problems down the line, and you most likely end up either having an incomplete rig or a rig with problems, or you're going to have to start all the way over from the beginning. So I'm going to show you my workflow, how I deal with every step, and what steps I think are really important. And I'll start with up here at the top. I have Advanced Skeleton installed on the custom shelf. You can make a separate shelf just for this, but I really only use this custom shelf for this. Dock it to the side. And we're going to be dealing with this pre-section here. So before I get into this, I'll just show you my setup. So I have some lights, not needed. I like to have them in my scene just in case I want to turn them on and run a render, especially when I'm checking the deformation. Make sure it looks good, not only in scene, but while it's rendered. I've got the main body here. Pretty polydense. I have a lower subdivision of this, but I prefer to rig the second subdivision level up. And it's not too heavy that it breaks Advanced Skeleton, but I think any heavier than this, you're probably going to run into some problems. I think most rigs are usually a lot lower poly than this, but it's good because this is kind of like pushing it to the extreme as far as poly density. You can rig a lower poly, and then there's ways to, you can either copy the weights over to a higher poly if you'd like, if you want to work with a lower poly while animating. So besides the body, I have the eyes separate into two sections. And then I have the teeth separated into 5 pieces, the tongue, the gums, upper and lower, and then the teeth, upper and lower. And I actually had an older model where I had the 2 sections of the gums connected. And you can do that. I've seen it where the gums were connected to the tongue and each other, and only the teeth were separate. And it does work, but it's a little bit trickier when it comes to the face setup because you actually have to select polygroups instead of just selecting an entire mesh. And it can cause problems. It's a little bit trickier, but it can be done. I prefer it this way since it's a simpler setup, and there's going through the whole Advanced Skeleton process is complicated. And then I also have my hair, which I did not have turned on, and it's just a series of hair plates, and then some XGen interactive grooms attached to those. Here are the hair plates, and these are really useful because you can just skin these or wrap them to your rig, and you don't have to worry. Then you can go back and change hairstyles or add hairstyles or whatever you want. It's really useful for later on. All right, so the first step here is model clean, and if I pull up the little question box, I usually skip this step. You can do this if you'd like. It exports everything as an OBJ and re-imports it in, and essentially what it's trying to do is clean up your scene as much as possible, take up as little memory as possible, and that way when you reference your rig into another scene to animate, it won't be slow and clunky. But I try to keep my scene pretty clean regardless, and you can achieve pretty similar results by deleting your history, edit, delete all by type history, and going to optimize scene size, and this will delete a lot of the unused nodes. Exporting out as an OBJ, you might lose some of your data. You'll lose your lights. You'll lose some of you may lose your texture maps. I've had mixed results. You might lose your XGen. So I like to have everything set up before I start the rig. Make sure it renders right, make sure it looks good, and then start on rigging. But if you're not following that workflow, you can do the model clean, and start from there. Otherwise, I just save it out as a separate file for my model, and then when I start the rigging, I'll save it as like mail rig 01, and then save iterations along that process. What I think is actually more important than this model clean is checking for symmetry. So you should, I actually think this should probably be first before you clean your model, because if you clean your model and then you check for symmetry and it's asymmetrical, you have to go back and go through the process of deleting a side, duplicating it over, merging it, all of that. And if you look down here, I have this male body 02 asym, short for asymmetrical. And this is the body that I brought in. So this was sculpted in ZBrush mostly. You can see it looks symmetrical. If I start selecting edges, let me turn on Symmetry Object X. If I start selecting edges, you can see it's all showing up blue, meaning that Maya is recognizing the symmetry. And you can go all over this model, and even though it looks perfectly symmetrical, and it will work with Maya symmetry, Advanced Skeleton's really, really picky. It wants very, very precise symmetrical vertices. So I'm going to go over quickly how I went from this to this model, and you can see it's not perfectly symmetrical. The more you sculpt in an external program, or even within Maya or Mudbox, and you have symmetry turned on, the longer you sculpt, the brushes aren't necessarily as precise as needed, and will eventually become slightly asymmetrical. And that can compound over time, and you'll get problems like this. Especially when it gets really tight, like in the corners of the mouth. Let me turn off everything except for the body. All right. So this is the good body. But I'll just turn that off for this demonstration. So we want to take this and we want to make it symmetrical. You can check the symmetry by doing model check and then hitting check with whatever you want selected. And this is going to take a long time to run through because this model is really polydense, but I'll just do it and I'll either cut or fast forward through this, but it's going to take a little while. All right, so this just finished, took a little while. And as you can see, everything highlighted. This was off to the side. Everything highlighted in yellow, all the vertices are not symmetrical. So even though it looked as if it was, and it would function within the program with the Advanced Skeleton plugin, you got to go through these extra steps. So how do we fix this? Object mode. All right. So first thing, I just have this just for the point of demonstration. I have this model as asym. I'm going to duplicate it and label this one as sim. I'll hide that first one, and now this is the one that we're going to duplicate over. So select, turn off symmetry, go to your center line. Now this may not apply to you, and you might have to go through and select the faces individually if you don't have a center line that runs through your model, but I think this is really important for all organic character modeling. Have the center line, one poly loop that runs through your character. So it makes it a lot easier just to select a poly loop off to the side, and then I delete that, and I can double click and select that entire island of polys. And now I'm left with one half. Now what we want to do is make this poly loop perfectly flat along the x-axis. So a trick to do that, switch to scale, and you want to grab the x and just keep pushing it to the center. Push it to the center a few times, and after a while you don't need to anymore. And now when you switch to your front view, this will be perfectly straight. Now what you want to do is zoom in, push this over just across the x-axis. In fact, you want it to be really close to the x-axis, because if you push too far, you might overlap some of the internal polys, and it'll make your model look ridiculous. Essentially what you want is everything to be on this side of the x-axis, and it looks like may have some that need to get pushed over. I think that's the rear. Yeah, like the groin area. So you can see it's very subtle, but this is important, how this is overlapping. You got to be careful. All right. Now, delete the history. I just hit Shift-Alt-D, and now I want to duplicate special. Edit, duplicate special, which is just Shift-Control-D. You want to be scaling -1 on the x-axis. Select both halves, go up to Mesh, Combine. Now when I switch back to Edge, that center line should be still selected on both halves. And I'll just show you, I'll zoom in really far so I can show you what's going on here. Go up to your modeling toolkit and select Bridge, and then change your divisions to 1. So now you have that center line again, and then hit Control, Delete, and you'll get rid of those 2 extra polyloops. And now you should have a model that exactly matches the asymmetrical one in terms of poly count. So display, has a display, poly count. So the UVs are now different, and the shape of the model is a little slightly different, but you have the exact same amount of polys, vertices, and edges. Now, the next big problem is, so let me just show you, these are the UVs that I have for, this is what the UVs look like on the asymmetrical model. This is what we want, and if you look at the new model that we just built, everything, half of everything has been deleted. So what we need to do is transfer the attributes from one to the other. So make sure the history is deleted on both. You probably want to save at this point. And you want to select the model with the correct UVs, and then Control select the model where you want to transfer those UVs to. Go up to Mesh, Transfer Attributes, and you can play around with these settings. It might crash Maya. The one that I've had the most success with is in World Space, and you want to copy over your vertex normals. You want to copy over the positions of your vertex normals. And you also want to copy over your UV set. Current or all will work. And your color sets you don't need, and you don't want to do the vertex position because that will make the one that we just went all through the trouble to fix asymmetrical again. And then closest to point, I've tried both along normal and closest to point. I think this closest to point gives me a little bit better results. And then transfer. All right, so now let me just zoom in. So now you can see, did a pretty good job transferring those over. Now it might give you a little bit of trouble on certain areas where the polys didn't match up very well, and you're going to have to go through and fix some of that. But overall, it did a pretty good job. It doesn't do a perfect job. Oh, that looked all good. Some of the polys might have shifted. I think it looks, yeah, like slightly here on the hand. But I don't think that's going to move enough to make a difference. Now, the symmetrical and asymmetrical model were really close in this instance, and the greater the difference, the more trouble you're going to have transferring those UVs over. There's other techniques. You could try to do a mesh projection, or you could try to transfer the vertex position, or the vertex position of the asymmetrical to try to match the symmetrical one, and then transfer the UVs over. Because this wasn't that big of a deal, I'm just going to go through and fix these issues on the UV map. I think it was only this right section of the mouth. Another really important thing, before you do anything else, delete your history. If you go over the inputs, transfer attributes is still there. The node is still attached. And if you were to delete the asymmetrical model, you would delete these UVs on the symmetrical one, and you'd be stuck with half your UVs. Then you have to re-import your model, transfer the attributes over again, etc., etc. So before you do anything, if you want to, I recommend holding on to this one, or at least export it out as an FBX to save the asymmetrical one, just in case something happens. But for now, just select both of them and delete the history. And now you're free, if you really want to, delete the asymmetrical version. All right. I'm not going to go through, I don't want this to be incredibly long, so I'm not going to go through the entire process of fixing these busted UVs, but I'll show you my workflow real quick, and then you can apply it. So wherever there's the thicker white outline, that means that it's now at the edge of a poly, or the edge of a UV shell. And what happened was, when it did the transfer attributes, because some of the polys weren't matching up, it then took those remainder polys and just created their own UV shells, and then they're kind of floating in space where like in an approximate area. So what we can do is select one of these floating shells, hit Control S or Shift S to sew, and then hit Control U to unfold. Selected mesh is not always fix. All right, so once you've cleaned up your UVs, you're then ready to go back, group your model under a top node called Geo, if you want, and then run the clean. But I'm going to skip that step. But it is important to group everything together. I can just delete these now. It is important to group everything together under a top node named Geo, because part of the script for Advanced Skeleton relies on that. It looks for a group named Geo. And then these options down here, you can create a separate file for the rig. I also just do this manually. I just will save out, I think I mentioned this in the beginning, I have this saved out as like male_model, and then I will save out a separate file, male_rig01, and that will take care of the first part of the process. So and once you create that other file, you can reference it in. I don't really like to reference in my model. I usually just, for the building process, I just rely on saving out those separate iterations. That is it for the prep portion of setting up your model. Next, we're going to do the body and then the face, and then after that, I'll show you corrective blend shapes, all the post work, painting the weights, my techniques for mirroring over the painted weights and how to get everything clean. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in part 2.